Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. We're continuing to focus on aspects of the COVID-19 crisis. In today's episode, we explore the truly jaw-dropping and extraordinary story of Barbara Mancini, a nurse whose father had very clear wishes about the way he wanted to die. And what ends up happening is really so disturbing. He did not die the way he wanted to, and she ended up getting arrested and prosecuted for allegedly assisting in his attempted death. The story of what happened to her entire family in the healthcare system, in the hospice care system, and in the legal system is at least an occasion to learn some lessons. And Barbara then shares those lessons, how to avoid having happen what happened to her and to her family. And of course, now in this time that we're all experiencing, all of us, these issues of death and dying and what it means and what medical treatment is and should be, is something we're all very, very focused on. So I feel like this is a very timely subject to explore, a difficult subject to explore, but an important one to be thinking about. So a fascinating conversation with Barbara Mancini. I know you will find it informative and fascinating as well. Please, everyone, stay safe, stay healthy, take great care, and enjoy this next episode of Good Law, Bad Law. Today we are speaking about a difficult topic, death and dying, and how people experience dying in the very extraordinary circumstances that we're all facing with this pandemic, but also in the context of the extraordinary experience of my guest, Barbara Mancini. First of all, Barbara, thank you so much for giving your time to join us on Good Law, Bad Law today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Barbara is the author of a recent book called Cruel Death, Heartless Aftermath, My Family's End-of-Life Nightmare and How to Avoid It. Even more extraordinary than the book, which I finished reading this morning, is the experience that she went through with her father and her family, which is the subject of this book. And there are a lot of lessons in your story, Barbara, not only in ordinary times as people think about and plan to work with their loved ones to die with dignity and avoid some of the things that your own father was trying to avoid, and you were very conscientious and determined and loving to try to help him avoid. But all the more so, I think, again, because of how publicly and as a community, and indeed, I think as a country, we're thinking about and confronting death and dying now. So perhaps you could give us just a little bit of background about yourself. Of course, that's very relevant to what happened to you. And then let's get into your story, which is just an absolutely essential story, I think, for people to know about and understand. But perhaps you could start by giving us just a little background on yourself and some background on your father as well.
I'd be happy to do that. Well, I'm a resident of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I've been living here for over 3 decades. But I grew up in Pottsville, Pennsylvania, which is in Schuylkill County, about 100 miles, northwest of where I'm living right now. And I was one of 4 children. My father, Joseph, was one of 12 children born into a family of Eastern European immigrants. He was born in 1919. And his father was a coal miner. They grew up in a poor family. My father was a World War II veteran. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge in World War II and got a Bronze Star for that. And after the war, he came back home and he started his own business, and he became a successful businessman. He was a contractor who did heavy excavation work. And he was a really talented guy. He could build anything. He could fix anything. My mom often would say she never had to call a repair person for anything because my father could do everything.
Right.
So he was talented, independent, strong-willed. Like I said, I was one of 4 children, and I became a nurse, a registered nurse, and I've been living in this area for most of my adult life. I am an ER nurse. My father was healthy for most of his life, but he developed diabetes, when he became after his 60s. And he had other medical conditions, high blood pressure, heart disease, kidney disease. He had a stroke at one point, but he recovered from that. But he lived to old age. Eventually, at the age of 90, he was still climbing up onto the roof to fix it. But the fallout of all these medical conditions that he had eventually took their toll. And he got to the point at the age of 92 where he was fatigued all the time. He really couldn't do the things that he wanted to do any longer. He was having chronic pain. A lot of that probably was because he spent most of his working life doing pretty physical work, and he had arthritis. He had other things going on, so he was in pain a lot. He was fatigued. He just couldn't do the things in life that gave him pleasure, that made his life meaningful.
He was losing his independence, and that was
absolutely. And this was a person who was fiercely independent, and it was really, really important to him to have independence as part of a quality of life issue. So as he was failing and he became more frail, he made a decision to stop taking all the medicines that treated all these medical conditions he had. And, I talked to him about it. I was his healthcare power of attorney. We had, a few years before that, drawn up a living will. We had multiple discussions about what his values and wishes were. And he decided to stop taking all those medicines because he said, I'm done with it. I'm ready. I've lived long enough. And at that point, he enrolled in hospice care. And I will say that he visited his physician prior to that. Physician listened to all the reasons why he just wanted to stop any medical treatment, and everyone agreed to respect his wishes.
Well, now, Barbara, before you go any further, because you brought up some things, and I want to make sure people understand what these are, because it's very, very important in terms of end-of-life planning. So you mentioned a healthcare power of attorney, you mentioned an advance directive, and you mentioned hospice care. So just give a few sentences of background on what each of those things are.
Okay, advance directives and living will are used interchangeably. Basically, it's a legal document that states what your wishes are in the event that you become incapable of making your own decisions. So they don't become effective unless you lose your decisional capacity. But it's important for everybody to have that drawn up, and from the age of 18 on up, because there are situations that can occur where you lose decisional capacity. I mean, the case of Terry Schiavo is a perfect example of that. That's the young woman from Florida who had a cardiac arrest at home at the age of 29, and because of the lack of oxygen to her brain during that event, even though she was resuscitated, she then lived in a persistent vegetative state for, I believe, 13 years. And that became a national case. Our nation became aware of that case because there was disagreement among her husband and her parents about what her wishes would be. They weren't written down. So an advance directive is a way to avoid that kind of gut-wrenching situation. You discuss your wishes beforehand. you put him in a legal document that is then witnessed.
Mm-hmm.
And my father did take that step. He appointed me his healthcare power of attorney, and that would be the person who would make decisions for him, again, in the event that he would lose his decisional capacity.
Okay.
And what was the third thing we talked about?
Hospice.
Hospice care, yeah. Well, hospice is a model of care that's based on the philosophy that each of us has the right to have a death that is pain-free and that preserves the dignity of the person who is dying. It's been around since the 1970s in the United States, and at first it was an all-volunteer effort. But over time, it became something that was actually reimbursed by Medicare and most insurances.
Mm-hmm.
And hospice care is based on a team philosophy. So you have a team of a physician, registered nurses, social worker, pastoral or spiritual counselors, home health aides, volunteers, and they're all supposed to work together to devise a plan that will maximize the wishes of the patient and comport to that patient's values and allow them for a peaceful and dignified death.
Mm-hmm.
It's a wonderful concept.
And most of the time, central to the concept of hospice care is that you would receive end-of-life care at home as opposed to in a hospital, where most of the time you have doctors and nurses whose objective is to save your life and to extend or prolong your life, rather than have you be made comfortable so that you can die peacefully and die, as you pointed out, die with dignity. Isn't that part of what is central to the idea of hospice care?
Absolutely. And I want to point out here that there are criteria that have to be met to qualify for hospice care. I mean, you just can't get it willy-nilly. The person has to be determined to have a terminal condition. In other words, they're going to die within 6 months if the disease or the condition takes its natural course. And two physicians or healthcare providers have to agree that that's what the case is for a person to qualify for the hospice benefit. So the point is that you are no longer going to seek life-prolonging care. You're going to seek care that will palliate the symptoms of terminal disease. So palliate means ease the discomfort of a terminal disease. And again, it's a wonderful concept, and I fully support that if it is done correctly.
Mm-hmm. And as I understand it, as your father was declining and became increasingly aware of the fact that he wasn't going to live much longer, and as you point out, this was confirmed by his own physician so that he could qualify for hospice care. One of the driving motivations, as I understand it, was that he did not want to go to a hospital. He did not want to be poked and prodded and put on machines and have his life prolonged in that way. So avoiding the hospital was really important to him.
He was absolutely clear on that point. I would say he was adamant on that point. He wanted no hospitalizations. And he and I had multiple conversations about this. And that's ideally what people should be doing. You don't just talk about your end-of-life wishes once and then done, because over time things can change. So as a person's condition changes, whether it's a physical condition or a social condition changes like a divorce or a death of a spouse, you need to revisit these conversations periodically. And that's something that he and I did on a regular basis.
Right.
So I was well aware of what his wishes were. In fact, my mother was. My entire family was aware of it. His primary provider was aware of it. So this was not a situation where no one knew what he wanted. He was.
And also, Barbara, and also the hospice folks who you're going to explain got involved. They had to have been aware of it, because not only does he have to be accepted into a hospice program, but they don't get paid, as you pointed out, unless there's a plan and unless there's an understanding of why he's in hospice and what that's going to involve.
And that's correct. And I will say that his hospice provider did know of his wishes to stay at home It was documented in the hospice record. So there was never any equivocation on that point whatsoever.
Okay. All right. So that all sounds so far like pretty responsible thinking through and planning for the inevitable. There may be lots of people who don't want to think about these things. It's difficult to think about one's own mortality. It's difficult to think about dying and what that might look like. But for those who do think about it, as your father did and you were talking about it, and all the people involved in his medical care, it so far sounds like a story of really responsible, thoughtful, caring, attention to how to respect your father's wishes.
It was responsible, and research shows that only a third of adult Americans, maybe even less than that, ever prepare an advance directive, which is a shockingly low rate. I think a lot of it is because of our cultural reticence to acknowledge that we're all going to die someday. People just don't want to talk about it. And but we did. We had those conversations. They weren't painful conversations. They were honest and realistic. So we did what most people don't do. And I thought that was enough to protect him, to protect us, and to ensure that he would have the kind of death that he hoped to have. And I was wrong.
Yeah. Okay. So tell us that part of the story, please. I know it's was an incredibly painful few days there, and that pain continued for a long time after. But people need to understand what happened and how things went wrong.
Well, this is back in 2013, and he had been in the hospice, enrolled in this home hospice care. And most hospice care is provided in people's homes. I will say that. There are exceptions to that, but he was in home hospice care. In that situation, the family is considered to be the caregivers, and the hospice acts as a support service. So my father was in this home hospice care for 2 weeks. He had a hospital bed in the living room. He was suffering. It was curious to me that he didn't have any medicine for pain. He'd been prescribed pain medicine in the past, but he didn't have any medicine for pain. And under hospice rules per Medicare, and this is covered by federal law, the hospice is responsible for all care related to the terminal illness. So I called the hospice and I asked them to prescribe morphine for my father. He had been on it in the past. I spoke to a hospice team leader, a supervisor, and she didn't want to do that. She told me that she thought it was inappropriate for him to have that. I disagreed with her. My dad was taking tons of Tylenol and Motrin at home to self-medicate to treat his pain. But eventually this morphine got ordered for him, and it was a low dose, and he started taking it. So he'd been on it for over a week, and he fell. He was falling a lot at home, but he fell one day, and after that fall, that night was the worst night he ever had. I mean, he was in terrible pain. He wouldn't even get undressed to go to bed that night. He wouldn't let my mother and my brother touch him. I was in Philadelphia. They were in Pottsville. My mother was on the phone, tearful with me. He told them he felt like they were breaking his bones when they just tried to remove a very loose shirt. So I went up the next morning. This was February 7th, 2013. And my dad asked me to hand him his pain medicine. Now, my father was competent. He still was ambulatory, although he was a little wobbly. So he had his full faculties. And my mother had this routine where she'd hand him this. It was a 1 ounce vial of liquid morphine. He would remove the cap because it was a child-proof cap, which she couldn't manage. So I did the same routine. He asked for the morphine. I handed it to him. I had the dosing syringe in my hand. He took the cap off, and he drank what was left in that vial. Now, I don't know exactly how much was in it. It's only a 1 ounce vial. It's concentrated morphine. I don't know if he was just at the end of his rope and so uncomfortable that he made an impulsive decision, or I don't know if this was calculated on his part. He didn't say that either way to me. But I realized that he may have consumed a very large dose of morphine. And I didn't know what to do, because he made it very clear he never wanted to go to a hospital.
Mm-hmm.
His pain had been undertreated. And I thought about it for a while, and I sat with him, and I just decided to honor his wishes.
Mm-hmm.
So I was there with him about 2 hours, and a hospice nurse called and said she wanted to come see my dad because he had fallen the day before. And I said, okay, you can come over. And she arrived 15 to 20 minutes later. And when she got there, I told her what happened. When she arrived there, my father was drowsy, but he was not unconscious. He was breathing normally. He was able to follow commands. He could respond to questions. But the hospice nurse insisted that I call 911 and have him taken to an ER to be treated for an overdose.
And by the way, Barbara, if he had taken an amount of morphine sufficient to cause him to die, he wouldn't have had those symptoms that you described. I mean, he wouldn't. In other words, the way that if you take a sufficient amount of morphine to kill you, it's going to depress your breathing sufficiently that you just stop breathing, right? I mean, that
is how any kind of narcotic overdose kills a person. It causes respiratory depression. Well, this was 2 hours after he took it. The type of morphine was a rapid acting morphine, and he actually, hours after that, still was breathing on his own. So again, I don't know how much was in there, and but anyway, the hospice nurse and her supervisor insisted that he had to go to the ER, and I resisted that strongly. And so they called 911, and I resisted because I was trying to honor what his wishes were. I was trying to do exactly what my father said wanted done.
Right.
And I blame the hospice in a lot of ways because they were not honoring their commitment by law to ensure that my father's symptoms were adequately treated. But anyway, they called 911, and the Pottsville police arrived within a few minutes. And a few minutes after that, or maybe 10 minutes later, an ambulance came with paramedics. And the police officer told me that my father was going to be going to the ER, that I no longer had any say in what would happen to him. And I pleaded with the police and with the medics to leave my father alone. I said, he's suffering. He wants to die. Why are you doing this to him? Well, they carted him off to the ER, and I was arrested on the spot in my parents' home by this police officer. He told me he was charging me with aiding an attempted suicide.
Oh, my God.
It was a surreal experience, absolutely surreal. And my mother went over to the hospital where my dad was taken. And the hospital personnel asked my mother to give her consent for the hospital to treat her because of what they were told by the police and the paramedics. They felt that my father could not make his own decisions at that point. And then the police told my mother, who was elderly, she was in her late 80s at the time, they told her that if my father died, things would go much worse for me. So here's my elderly mother put in this terrible position of having to choose between honoring her promise to my father, which was to honor his wishes, or trying to help me, her daughter, who is in big trouble now.
Wait, so you're in a police station as your mother is talking to the doctor at the hospital about her husband, your father, and she's being given this choice: either respect her husband's wishes, or if not, and he dies, she knows, or she's being told anyway, that things are going to get worse for you because his death would mean a more serious charge against you.
Yes.
Oh my God.
So because of that terrible situation, terrible decision she had to make, she felt that she had to do what she could to help me. And she gave her consent for the hospital to treat my dad.
But at that point, Barbara, he had an advance directive, and this is why I wanted to explain this earlier. You told us that the advance directive, first of all, is a legal document. That ought to mean something, and that it comes into effect at a point where the subject of the advance directive, your father in this case, can't make decisions, and the point of it is to guide medical decision making. But
it is, but
why wouldn't the doctors at that point honor the advance directive?
Well, two things. First of all, legally, a healthcare provider does not have to honor it if they have deeply held convictions that they find objectionable in this document. But I don't think that was the case here. I think the case was that ER doctor was given a one-sided report on what happened there, and it wasn't factual. It wasn't correct. So, they were told by this hospice nurse and the police that I helped him try to end his life. And when I eventually got the ER records and saw what was written down, I mean, the information that was relayed to them was just not correct. So my mother signs this consent for treatment. No one ever asked to see his advance directive, and she had no idea that once she gave that consent, that everything would be then done to prolong his life. She was in a state of stunned disbelief. You're not really processing things correctly when you're put in a situation like that. And anyway, my father stayed in that ER for I don't know how many hours, 6 or 7 hours. It was about 4 hours after he consumed the morphine that his respiratory rate then finally went down to about, I'm sorry, I'm going to backtrack on that. That's not correct. His respiratory rate never went below a concern threshold in the ER. The ER physician ordered for him to have Narcan anyway because he was drowsy, but he's still breathing normally. His oxygen rate was fine, but they gave him a dose of Narcan, which is a narcotic reversal drug. And when he received that, he was livid, absolutely livid that he was in the hospital. He knew I was in trouble. He pulled out his IV, pulled off the heart monitor. He was shouting at everybody there, and he was yelling for them to stay away from me. And but
to stay away from you and to stay away from him.
Oh, well, he tried to actually leave, and he was made to stay there.
Okay.
He ended up getting admitted to the hospital to a intensive step-down unit, and he lived for 5 days, developed pneumonia, all kinds of other critical life-threatening things. His kidneys failed. His potassium level in his blood became critically high. His heart rate was in the 150s, which is a lot faster than normal. He had fevers. A lot of bad things happened to him.
He got bed sores just from how weak his skin was, and that can be very painful too.
Yes.
And meanwhile, so he lived for 5 days in the hospital, and then what? He died in the hospital?
He did. He developed pneumonia, which progressed to sepsis. Sepsis is a generalized infection throughout the body, a generalized response to infection in the body. And the sepsis then progressed to something called metabolic acidosis, which there's basically the pH in your blood, the acid base level of the blood becomes too acidic. It's not compatible with life. And he died. And it was a pretty horrible death because he was placed on a ventilator type of support, a CPAP machine, for hours before his death. And But interestingly, a few hours before he died, he received more morphine in the hospital.
Wow.
Intravenously. So it was just kind of a crazy, who could imagine this kind of scenario taking place? But he died. The local coroner...
Well, before you get to the coroner, and because the issue of them giving him morphine is important because, I mean, you know the medical records in and out, but the reason you would give morphine in that situation is for the patient's comfort, is to ease their pain. So they were doing the very thing that your father was trying to do for himself, except you got arrested for it.
Yeah, and I don't know that I would put it that way, that they were doing the very thing that I got arrested for. He received morphine when it was clear he was not going to survive no matter what.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So he didn't get it every day while he was in the hospital. He did get it hours before he died. And the reason I started to mention the coroner, the local coroner, and I'm going to preface this by saying in Pennsylvania, we have a mixed medical examiner and coroner system. The large urban areas like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh have medical examiners who do death investigations. And medical examiners are physicians. Most of them are trained pathologists, not all of them. Mm-hmm. But, I mean, they're qualified to do that job. In the other counties in Pennsylvania, we have coroners, and they are elected. And in Pennsylvania, you don't have to have any training, medical training, to be elected coroner. Mm. It's an anachronistic, antiquated system that is still used to this day. Just so happens that the Schuylkill County coroner, David Moylan, happened to be a physician, but he was not a pathologist. He is a radiation oncologist, so he treats cancer patients with radiation therapy. And this coroner determined that my father died of a morphine overdose. And he ruled that my father's death was a homicide. When I saw that ruling, I can tell you that my heart dropped out of my chest, and I was stunned and frightened and angry because I knew he did not die of a morphine overdose.
I mean, the implications of that, Barbara, are that you murdered your father. I mean, that's...
Well, I'm going to be clear here. I was not charged with murder. I was charged with aiding and attempted suicide.
Yeah. Okay.
So in the state of Pennsylvania, that's considered a second-degree felony. But he ruled that my father's death was a homicide, which, in technical legal terms, that means death at the hands of another person.
I see. Okay.
So we had my father's funeral. I'm out on bail. I have to find legal representation and start to fight this charge against me.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
In the process of trying to help my own defense, I was really, really curious to see why a physician would rule that my father died of a morphine overdose when he clearly did not. And I discovered that this particular coroner had political ambitions, which he has every right to have, but he had announced not long after he released my father's death certificate, just a few weeks later, that he was running for United States Congress on a sanctity of life platform. So now these pieces were starting to fall into place.
So he's really trying to make an example of you for his own political purposes.
It seemed very clear that was what was going on. And I will mention, too, that much later down the road, I had medical experts look at all of my father's records, including a forensic toxicologist, because I just had to try to reconcile how that could be put on my father's death certificate when I knew it could not possibly have been that as his cause of death. And the forensic toxicologist told me that there was no way that my father died of a morphine overdose.
Where the morphine had been given to him 5 or 6 days earlier.
Yeah, it was metabolized out of his system at that point. And I go into more detail in the book about that. There's a lot to that part of the story. But
well, right. And just for our listeners, I mean, the book is gripping, very easy to read, very easy to understand, and a lot of detail about how you put this together and how and a lot more too about what you were going through. And on that, Barbara, I want to pause for a second, because while your father is in this hospital for these 5 days, leading eventually to death in the very way he wanted to avoid, you're being charged with a felony crime. And I mean, ordinarily, you would have been right by your father's side as he passed on, hopefully peacefully and pain free. But as a person who's now been charged with a felony crime, that had a big impact on how you could be there for him and for your family and even for yourself. Say a little bit about that, because I think that's an incredibly shocking and disturbing part of what you went through.
Well, when I was released from the police custody on bail, I went to the hospital afterwards, and it was evening by then. I was not permitted to see my father until he was placed in an inpatient room with a nursing assistant in attendance at all times. So there could be no unsupervised visits by me. Oh, fine, I stayed home in Philadelphia for the next 4 days. I was afraid to go and be with my dad. I was afraid that someone would come up with some other accusation against me if I went in to see my father. And to be honest with you, I didn't know what to do. I was stunned. I was grieving. It was just a terrible, terrible time. And I finally went up to see him. The day he died, I got a call at 3:00 in the morning from my mother saying that he made a turn for the worse, and she was called to come into the hospital. And it was an icy February day, and I'm driving up the Pennsylvania Turnpike, hoping not to get in a car crash, trying to get up to see my father. And I got there around 5 a.m., and he was on a CPAP ventilator. He looked horrible. I mean, he had swelling in both his arms because his heart had failed. He had indentations from the mask. He had skin breakdown. It was everything he never wanted to have done to him. And I just broke down in tears when I saw him. Yeah. So we waited till the attending physician got in that day, and we asked, my mother had to be the one to ask, because I was told by the police I had no say. I don't know if that was actually true, but they said I had no say in what could happen to my father. So my mother asked them to stop everything, which they did. And he survived another 5 hours or so until he finally died. And I was there at his side then. I don't know if he was aware that any of us were there that last day. He was comatose at that point, so who knows? Yeah.
Well, so you said something very interesting in the book. You said, I couldn't help thinking how the justice and medical systems are programmed to resist death at every turn, even for a 93-year-old man who explicitly documented that he wanted no heroic end-of-life measures. I want to come back to the medical side, because we told some of that story here, but and again, for people who want to hear, and I really encourage everybody to get this book so that you can see how the legal system just, I think, really failed you. It ultimately has a positive ending, but having gone through everything you went through, it's hard to look at it as an entirely positive ending because of what you went through. But I was very interested in this idea that you include the justice system as being programmed to resist death. I mean, you talked about the coroner. I guess give us just a brief outline of what happened after your father died in your case. It became a very celebrated case with a lot of public interest at the time. But tell our listeners in brief what happened to you there.
Well, my case became public knowledge, and I would say a good part of that was because of the efforts of Compassion and Choices, which is an end-of-life advocacy organization who, when they learned of my case, they were outraged by it. And next thing I know, major news outlets are talking about my case. And it went over the AP Newswire, the New York Times, LA Times. It was showing up everywhere, even in global news outlets. And to a one, the reaction to my case was outrage. And it wasn't outrage directed at me.
Yeah.
It was outrage directed at the hospice and the police and the prosecutors for pursuing this and doing this to my father and to me. And I mean, it was really stunning. I mean, there were dozens of opinion pieces written about my case. And it was some very eloquently worded pieces about how wrong this was. And I have to recognize here that I am a very rare person being charged with a crime and having that kind of public support.
Yeah.
That rarely ever happens.
Right.
So
but this went all the way. This went all the way to the Attorney General's office in Pennsylvania, and they became the prosecutors. I mean, you had to go through several hearings where evidence was presented and witnesses were cross-examined. The hospice nurse was brought in to testify against you.
Yes.
I mean, you had to go through all of that ultimately for what to happen.
Well, it took a whole year, and a Schuylkill County Common Pleas judge dismissed the case, saying that there was no merit to it. So it was an entire year. And, the right outcome finally happened after a year of hell.
Yeah.
And so I applaud the judge who did the right thing and meticulously researched what was said in testimony and researched case law, and she made the right decision. And so after $104,000 in legal fees and after losing my job, finally the right thing happened. I was offered my job back, and Compassion and Choices set up a legal defense fund. I was able to recover a lot of my legal fees, not all of it, but a lot of it. And there was a tremendous amount of support out there for my whole family and for me, and a lot of outrage about
and from your husband, right? You had a husband and children also who were going through this with you.
Yeah, my husband, who, I lost my job while this case was being litigated. So there's my income gone. We drained our savings account. We had to borrow money to pay for my defense lawyer. I had my older daughter was in her first year of college. It was a terrible, terrible thing to go through. And I'll tell you, I became very empathetic towards any family where someone is charged with a crime, and the distress and the destructive aspects of that on an entire family. It's quite an education.
So how, having gone through all of that, and thankfully, despite all the suffering and hardship on almost every level, I'd imagine, that you went through, ultimately the charges were thrown out. Finally, the judge wrote an opinion saying that basically saying the prosecution had no case, and the prosecution ultimately dropped the charges and decided not to pursue it any further. But how did your experience lead you to the view that the justice and the medical system seem programmed to resist death at every turn? And what did you mean by that?
Well, keep in mind, I've been a nurse for a long time. I worked in an ER. People who show up in an ER for treatment, everything's going to be done to save that person's life. That's the default of our healthcare system in this country. Mm-hmm. It's an imperative of our healthcare system to save lives. So, that's been existing long before this ever happened to me. The problem occurs when people who are dying or near the end of their lives have values and wishes that are different from the people who are tasked to provide medical care for that person. So, in my father's case, he was very open and explicit about his values and wishes. Once the police got involved, then that redirected how his medical care was going to be given to him. Because the police presence at the hospital, even if care providers, nurses, or physicians didn't agree what was happening to this 93-year-old man who was dying and now they were trying to keep him from dying, the police were there saying, you have to do life-saving treatment because we suspect a crime was going on here. And I found out after my case was dismissed from my attorney that a lot of the people working at that local hospital were aghast at being a part of this.
Mm-hmm. But it's like there was a threat hanging over their heads as well. Yes. Even if they felt the compassionate and correct treatment for the patient, for your father, the patient was compassionate treatment, which is to say no extraordinary measures. They felt this threat over their heads because of law enforcement's now involved. And you had already been charged.
Yes, according to what my attorney told me, they did feel that. And, I can't speak for these people directly, but I don't blame the people at the hospital at all for how this thing came about. Not at all. I think they were victims as well as my father and me. And I will say here that once I got my father's medical records and discovery, my father's hospice records, what I read in those records just absolutely incensed me, because I found out that my father had been prescribed morphine a full 2 weeks before I ever called about them giving him pain medicine. He had been prescribed the normal amount of morphine, which was 5 to 10 milligrams every 2 hours. He could double the dose if he needed to and titrate it upward. They never gave him the medicine that was ordered. And they never told my mother nor me about it. So I feel that hospice failure played a huge role in this whole debacle. And that's why I explore hospice failure in some depth in my book. Because prior to this happening to my dad and to me, I had a really positive impression of hospice care. I think it's a great idea. It's a great model of care if it is done according to the Code of Federal Regulations, which is, the law that regulates hospice care. And once this happened to me, I pulled that law out and I read it from beginning to end. And I saw so many aspects where the hospice did not live up to what the law says it's supposed to do.
Why do you think that happened in your case? Because I'm sure that, as in all things, and I do a lot of healthcare litigation. I mean, I do medical malpractice cases. That doesn't mean I think, healthcare is terrible or all doctors or, anything. But things do happen and things do go wrong. Similarly, I'm sure there are, many, if not most, hospice providers are responsible, but certainly not everyone, and certainly not in your case. What do you think went wrong?
Well, again, hospice care is supposed to abide by this Code of Federal Regulations, conditions of participation. But there has to be oversight. Now, keep in mind, the vast majority of hospice care takes place in people's homes. So who's providing the oversight? In almost every case, it's the local Department of Health, the State Department of Health. Mm-hmm. They're underfunded. There was no mandate for them to have regular inspections or site surveys of hospice companies until actually after this happened to my father. And now the law says they have to be surveyed every 3 years. But there were cases in other states where hospices went 6, 7, or 8 years without any oversight inspections. So what do you think happens when no one's looking? Mm-hmm. The rules get bent, or things don't get done. And the other part of hospice care, and it's a rather unique form of payment for this type of health care, the way it's written into law is that once a person enrolls in hospice care, the hospice gets paid a daily rate. They get paid no matter what, every day from the time the person enrolls until the person either dies or is discharged out, mm-hmm. regardless of whether they receive services on a given day or not. So in my father's case, he was supposed to have a nurse visit twice a week, but the hospice got paid 7 days a week.
I see.
Now, that formula has left hospice care as the most profitable Medicare-funded health care plan out there, health care benefit. And it has led to the proliferation of for-profit hospice companies. And they now dominate the industry. And I think the lack of oversight, the fact that they get paid no matter what they do or do not do, has led to some bad players. And I am not saying by any means that all hospice providers are providing poor care. I believe most of them do a good job. But there are some bad or poor quality hospice providers out there. And that's not saying it just from my experience. Mm-hmm. Health and Human Services Department did a report in 2018 and again in 2019, their Office of the Inspector General, and they did extensive reports on quality care problems in hospice care. And I have references to that in my book, the links to that, and I also have it on my website. So people can read this. And there's some pretty disturbing things that when they looked at hospice care over, I believe it was a decade of care being provided, and found some pretty severe infractions.
Well, that's an important. I'm glad you mentioned that, because your book is very well sourced. I mean, this isn't just you ranting and raving on this issue. I mean, you provide citations, you have appendices that provide all kinds of resources where people can go and get more information, and we'll provide links to all that when we get to the end. So, but I'm glad you mentioned that, because there are a lot of resources on this, and you've done a lot. Not only did you know more than most of us because of your nursing background, but you've learned a lot in the course of going through this, and you share a lot of those resources and a lot of that information in the book. So what then, and there's a lot of in the book toward the end as well about how to avoid this happening, how people can avoid having this kind of thing happen to them. But and we obviously don't have time to go through all of that, but maybe you could distill for us some of the key things that you think people ought to keep in mind. Because I think people want to know. God, this is a horrible thing that happened to your entire family. Shouldn't have happened at all. A very different outcome, should have happened. What are some things that people ought to keep in mind, do you think?
Well, I'm still a strong advocate for advanced care planning. That is, having the conversations with your loved ones about their values and their wishes, and putting that in writing in a living will or advanced directive, whatever you want to call that. That is very, very important. Appointing a healthcare power of attorney, very important. And that's what we did. There's another document that can be filled out in most states. Not all states have adopted this. It's called a POLST form, POLST. It stands for Physician Order for Life-Sustaining Treatment, or medical order. That is considered a portable healthcare directive. In other words, it's in effect no matter where the person is, whether they're outside of a healthcare facility whether they're in a advanced or assisted living or nursing home or in a hospital. It's an actual physician order, and it is supposed to be honored by all care providers. I had no idea that existed. Pennsylvania adopted that back in 2011, and I'll be perfectly honest and tell you that most physicians don't even know what it is.
Yeah.
But it is a document that further impacts on whether your wishes can be followed or not. So I do discuss it in the book. I'm a real proponent of using a PULSE form. Another thing, once you have all these records, you have to have a hard copy with you. Even in this age of digital everything, you can never assume that advanced directives will be available in electronic form. Even if, carrying around on a flash drive isn't going to work, because most hospital systems do not want to plug in someone's flash drive into their computer system because of virus risk, So you need to have hard copies of your forms, easily accessible. Don't lock them away in a safe deposit box. And I'm going to just pivot a little bit to the legal side of this. This legal nightmare that I went through was because the statute in Pennsylvania that criminalizes aiding a suicide is vaguely written.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's so vaguely written that it can be interpreted in myriad ways. I mean, basically what it says is that a person who intentionally aids or solicits another to commit suicide is guilty of a felony. Now, it's so broadly worded that it actually probably is unconstitutional, because it doesn't tell you what behaviors or acts are actually prohibited by law. But these laws have not been challenged on an appellate level. So what I would like to see happen is that we do not have laws that equate the wish of a dying person to have a peaceful and comfortable death that they're able to control in some way as the same thing as suicide. And the only states that make that distinction are the states that have aid in dying, physician aid in dying. So right now that's 8 states plus the District of Columbia. I think we need to modify our laws, and I absolutely believe that we need to adopt aid in dying in all 50 states so that these kinds of situations don't happen to other people. And I just want to mention
we actually did an episode. Yeah, go ahead. Finish.
I just want to mention that the American Association of Suicidology, which is an organization that exists to prevent the tragedy of suicide, they recognize the distinction between physician aid in dying, someone wants to access that, and what they ordinarily describe as suicide, the mental health crisis that they work so hard to prevent. Yeah. So that's another part of this is, and of course, enacting a change in the law is going to mean that people have to vote in every election, and they have to tell their elected legislators how they feel about this. And that's more of a long-term strategy. Short-term, people have to write their wishes down and have their documents easily accessible.
Well, and along with that, it seems pretty clear, and I know that I feel confident you're going to agree with me on this, is raising awareness and education, because you were charged with aiding a suicide completely different from what in fact was going on. As you point out, and we actually did an episode on this not that long ago, there are a number of states that have aid in dying statutes. Pennsylvania isn't one of them, but there are several states that are coming in to join those. That I think Maine and I want to say New Jersey recently have added aid in dying statutes. Isn't that right?
Yeah, there are 8 states. It's Washington, Oregon, California, Colorado, Hawaii, Montana, Vermont, and New Jersey, and the District of Columbia.
Right, okay.
And there are a number of other states that are considering aid in dying legislation. Currently, there was legislation introduced in Pennsylvania where I live, where we both live, but I don't think it's even gotten a committee hearing. But New York and Maryland and Delaware are moving farther along with their aid in dying legislation. So it's happening in other places.
Well, and again, I think, you have committed yourself to education and raising awareness of these issues from the experience that you went through, because there is a very big difference between the mental psychological issues that lead to suicide and the kind of responsible, loving, and respecting oneself, as well as one's loved ones respecting the dying person. There's a very different set of values and motivations between suicide and what you went through and what other people surely are going through right now. And that's I guess where I wanted to try to finish up is, when somebody has an advance directive, often one of the most common features of life prolonging treatment that people want to avoid is being placed on a breathing machine or a ventilator. And I was thinking about that as we were setting up this conversation today, because, of course, in this coronavirus pandemic, we've heard an awful lot about ventilators, and we've heard an awful lot about people who are elderly and have a lot of medical conditions underlying, who end up in hospitals and end up on ventilators, and uh, and generally don't do very well on the ventilators. I mean, the latest numbers I saw was something like 80% of people who've been put on a ventilator for COVID-19 don't survive, despite having been put on a ventilator.
I've heard that same. Yeah.
Right. So I'm just curious. I don't know exactly where I'm going with this, to be honest, Barbara, but we are all, it seems, in this very public uh, experience, thinking about death and thinking about the way people are dying because of this pandemic. And I'm wondering, what are some of your thoughts as you've been going through this along with the rest of all of us, given the experience that you've had and this issue that obviously you feel so strongly about?
Well, first I'll say that coronavirus has kind of turned everything on its head. Now more people are worrying about premature death than a prolonged dying process when it comes to coronavirus. But we still need to talk about what kind of interventions we would want to have. My husband and I have discussed that with each other and with our adult daughters. We've made it clear, personally for us, we would not want to be ventilated. That's a decision everybody has to make, and it's really important to discuss this now, because certainly your mortality is more obvious in a pandemic where there are high death rates. And I would just urge any listeners and their loved ones and people who matter to them to not put off these conversations, because if you wait till it's too late and you're in an ER and suddenly an ER doctor has to make a decision, you may get interventions that you never would want to have. So it is vitally important that people talk about this. And, we may be lucky and not get the coronavirus. We may not die from it, but a lot of people are going to. And I think that's pretty clear where that's going in this country. So it's not a conversation that can be put off for another day.
Well, and we're going to get through it. It's going to take longer than most of us wish it would, but we will. And then there's going to be, I think, a focus on some of these issues, perhaps with the background of what we've all been through. And I don't think we know fully the answer to the question: how will our views change on these things? But it is a lot of people. I mean, look, obviously, it's very different if a child comes down with this, or someone in their 20s or 30s. But a lot of elderly people who are very sick to begin with, or have a lot of medical issues to begin with, we are very much more focused on that. Those are very vulnerable members of our communities and of our families, and I mean, we don't want them to suffer. I mean, we don't want them to die either, but we don't want them to suffer. So I feel like these are conversations that I think you're right to encourage the conversations. It doesn't determine a particular outcome. It just means you're not avoiding the issue either. You're having a conversation so that people can make decisions for themselves rather than have what could become very important decisions made for them if they don't do those things.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember, too, that when you're having conversations, say about ventilators or about feeding tubes or blood products, you don't have to be either or. You can decide that, yes, I would like to have a trial of a certain therapy and see how it goes. And if it doesn't work, then I want an end point to that. So it doesn't have to be black and white. You can discuss. I think the most valuable thing is for people to discuss what they feel would be an acceptable quality of life if an intervention doesn't work out the way they want it to.
Mm-hmm.
How do you proceed from there? And I just hope that more people start having those conversations.
Well, and I hope more people will get your book and read it as I did. As I said, the story of what you and your family went through is really a cautionary tale for all of us, as well as something I think we ought to feel a lot of sympathy for you for having to have gone through. Both the medical experience and the legal experience that followed, but also because a lot of what we're talking about now, people can find a lot of information, a lot of guidance, a lot of resources in the book, and we will put a link to the book in the description. But you also mentioned, Barbara, that you have a website. Perhaps you want to give us the link to that now. We'll include that in the description as well. But people can go to your website and get more information about all of the subjects we've been talking about there as well, right?
Yes, I have more resources on there. So it's BarbaraManciniStory.com.
Barbara Mancini, Mancini, story.com. And again, the name of the book, what is that? Sorry, what was the last part?
BarbaraManciniStory.com.
Okay. And the name of the book is Cruel Death, Heartless Aftermath. It published recently. Very, very compelling read about your father, your family, and what all you went through. Encourage everybody to get a copy of the book. And I want to thank you again, Barbara, for joining us and telling us, sharing your story and your commitment to helping other people avoid what you and your family went through. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.